In April 2000, Bruno Baumann walked into the Taklamakan Desert to test a story that had survived for 105 years. Not to admire it, to check it. The story belonged to Sven Hedin. In 1895, Hedin had tried to cross the Taklamakan from Merkit toward the Khotan River. His later memoir made the crossing famous. 5 men, 8 camels, a failing water supply, and a march that ended with 3 survivors, 2 reported escort deaths, and almost every camel gone. But when Baumann retraced the route, the old story did not hold cleanly. If Baumann was right, Hedin's memoir had not just preserved the disaster, it had protected one version of responsibility. That is the case. Not just what happened in the sand. Which account became the memory of what happened, and whether suffering made Hedin's version true. Go back to Merkit, 10 April 1895. The caravan is ready in the courtyard. 8 camels are tied into 2 strings of 4. The water tanks are loaded. Bread, rice, tools, instruments, and expedition gear are divided across the animals. Hedin has a route in mind, eastward across the desert toward the Khotan River. The people watching do not see a triumph of preparation. They see too much weight. In Hedin's own account, people in Merkit warn that the camels are overloaded and will not get through the deep sand. That warning is not local color. It is the first piece of evidence. Before the expedition fails, people who know the edge of the desert are already looking at the loads and seeing failure. The first scene is not dunes yet, not thirst yet. A town at the desert edge. Animals kneeling under too much gear. Iron water tanks being made part of a plan. Men who have watched caravans come and go, looking at the same preparation and reading it differently from the explorer. Hedin sees departure. Merkit sees a load problem. That difference is the first crack. There are 5 men. Hedin, the Swedish explorer. Islam Bai, the caravan leader. Mohammed Shah, a camel handler. Qasim Akun of Yarkand, who will survive. And Yolchi, the desert guide. Hedin gives Yolchi other names and titles, but for this episode, he is Yolchi, the desert guide, and the man whose knowledge would later survive, mostly through Hedin's suspicion. The nameless matters because the famous version can blur people into roles. The leader survives as a historical figure. The guide survives mostly as an accusation. At the start, the water arithmetic looks controlled. Hedin says 4 iron tanks and a goatskin held about 100 gallons. He calls that enough for a 25-day march. 5 men, 8 camels, 100 gallons. 25 days. Each number sounds like control until it is tied to an animal's back. Then it becomes weight, heat, distance, and a question no instrument can settle. That is where arithmetic stops being abstract. That is where the desert enters the math. And from that point on, every mile has to be paid for in water. There is no credit in sand. It sounds precise. That is the danger. Precision can look like safety even when it is only a number waiting to meet the ground. The ground was deep sand, uncertain wells, heat, and distances that did not behave like lines on a map. This is where the chronometer meets the water map. Hedin carried the world of European measurement with him. Watches, compass bearings, route notes, distances, observations. Those instruments could do real work. They could record the route. They could place a traveler on paper. They could turn movement into geography. But they could not answer the most important question in the Taklamakan. Where can you actually get water? That answer lived in another kind of map. Not a paper map necessarily, a lived one. Where to dig. Which plants meant moisture. How far a camel could go before a route stopped being a route. How much weight deep sand would allow. Hedin had access to that knowledge through Yolchi and the men around Merkit. The problem is that we mostly know it through Hedin. There is a source problem here. The guide enters history through the man who later needed someone to blame. Hedin describes Yolchi as a man who knew the desert. Then he immediately damages him as a witness, describing him through warnings, temper, suspicion, and later failure. That may reflect real conflict. It may also reflect a leader shaping the story after the fact. We do not have Yolchi's account. We do not have his family's account. We do not have a local record saying what he warned, what he advised, or whether Hedin listened. We have Hedin's memoir, published 3 years later. And then we have Baumann, walking the route in 2000, asking whether the memoir behaves like a record or like a defense. The crossing does not collapse all at once. For a while, the journey still looks possible. The men find places where water can be dug. They pass patches of vegetation. The camels move slowly, under loads the locals had already questioned. The line on the map is still alive. That is how a bad calculation survives its first tests. It gets just enough confirmation to keep going. The danger is that every partial success sounds like proof. A shallow well gives some water. A patch of scrub gives the camels something to tear at. A day's march ends without catastrophe. The route does not yet feel wrong, so the original decision keeps its authority. A little water in a dug hole. A compass bearing. A camel rising again. The route line moving one more day into emptier country. Then the desert begins to separate the plane from the bodies carrying it. The loads are heavy. The sand is deep. Wells give less than the men need. The animals slow down. Water stops being a column in a plan and becomes a sound inside iron tanks. At a later stage, Hedin's own account becomes more complicated. He writes that after advice and calculation near the desert lakes, he ordered enough water for 10 days, with the tanks only half full so the camels would not be overstrained in the deep sand. That matters. The story has two water numbers, and they cannot be collapsed into one. At the launch, 100 gallons, which Hedin calls enough for 25 days. Later, half-filled tanks meant to give a 10-day margin. Those are two different decisions. The later decision is the one that becomes fatal in the memoir's blame structure. Hedin says he expected the Khotan River in about 6 days, with diggable water before that. Yolchi, he says, believed water could be reached sooner. The maps Hedin had did not clearly contradict that confidence, so the caravan moved on. Then the tanks did not contain what Hedin expected. According to Hedin, he discovered they held only enough water for 2 days. The men pointed to Yolchi as responsible for the amount. Yolchi said the next water was only a short distance away. That is the moment the episode turns. Not because we can prove every word, because this is where the memoir begins arranging responsibility. If Hedin is right, Yolchi made a catastrophic judgment. If Hedin is incomplete, the story is doing something else, moving blame from the expedition leader onto the local guide. Either way, the water map is now missing at the exact moment it matters most. The warning from Merkit returns as fact. The camels were too loaded. The sand was too deep. The water plan was too confident. And the guide's knowledge, instead of being preserved as testimony, is being preserved as accusation. Then the caravan begins to break. The men try to dig. They find little or nothing. Hedin describes the water as something counted, guarded, listened to. Emptying tanks make noise. Failed wells turn hope into delay. A drink becomes an event. This is the part where the plan becomes visible as strain. Iron tanks in the sand. Men scraping at a dry hole. A camel that cannot rise. Hands on hot metal, checking whether a tank has anything left. Men listening for the sound of water instead of seeing it. The difference between we have supplies and we have a drink becomes the whole story. The route line still pointing east while the caravan itself stops moving like a caravan. The instrument did not fail by breaking. It failed by being trusted to answer the wrong question. A chronometer can tell Hedin the hour. A compass can hold a direction. Neither can tell him whether the sand under his feet will give water. By the time they reach the place, Hedin later calls the camp of death. The expedition has become a triage scene. Goods are abandoned. Scientific equipment, cameras, books, cloth, and other supplies are sorted and left behind. The tent is no longer a home. It is a marker. That image matters because it reverses the expedition. The objects that made Hedin's journey scientific now become weight. The camera cannot help. The notes cannot help. The equipment that was supposed to bring the desert into European knowledge has to be left in the desert so bodies can keep moving. This is not the desert defeating science in some simple way. It is more specific than that. It is the moment when the wrong kind of preparedness becomes cargo. Mohammed Shah and Yolchi in Hedin's account can no longer continue. Hedin, Islam Bai, and Qasim still can. The decision is to leave the two dying men and push east. This is the moral center of the story. This is not melodrama. If Hedin's account is followed, the immediate situation is extreme. No water, broken animals, men near collapse. Staying could mean 5 deaths instead of 2. But the last decision does not erase the earlier decisions that made it necessary. Who checked the tanks? Who chose the margin? Who accepted the route? Who had the power to decide that local caution was too cautious? The memoir gives an answer, but the answer comes from the man whose authority is being protected by the answer. Later, Hedin writes that rebuking Yolchi for putting a 4-day supply of water in the tanks instead of a 10-day supply would have done no good in the man's last moments. That sentence is powerful. It is also dangerous. I would not use it as fact. I would use it as evidence of where the memoir wanted responsibility to land. Because if Yolchi died, he could not answer. And if Baumann's retracing is correctly summarized, then the sentence becomes even more unstable. It may not only be blame, it may be blame attached to a death that the later retracing calls into question. That is why Baumann matters. Not because a 2000 retracing is a time machine. It is not. Baumann walked a changed landscape with modern knowledge and the advantage of knowing Hedin's published route. A retracing cannot recover Muhammad Shah's voice. It cannot tell us exactly what Yolchi said beside the water tanks. It cannot turn a modern expedition into a transcript of an 1895 camp. But it can test whether the memoir's physical story works. It can ask whether the water logic makes sense. It can ask whether the deaths remembered by the famous account are as certain as the famous account made them seem. And according to the Sven Hedin Foundation's summary of Baumann's work, at least one escort whom Hedin's tradition counted among the dead had survived. That does not make the crossing painless. It makes the authority incomplete. After the camp of death, the story narrows again to bodies in motion. Hedin, Islam Bai, and Qasim separate under exhaustion. Hedin and Qasim continue. The route is no longer a confident line. It is a sequence of desperate choices made by men whose senses are failing. On 5th May, according to Hedin's account, Hedin and Qasim are moving in darkness when they find footprints. For a moment, it looks like someone else has passed there. Then Qasim recognizes them. They are their own tracks. That image explains the whole case, not because it is the last possible fact, but because it is the perfect image of the case. The instruments still exist. The intended direction still exists. The men are still trying to go east, but the route has folded back on itself. The map is no longer mastering the desert. The desert is rewriting the map. Hedin eventually reaches the Khotan River forest and finds water. He brings water back to Qasim. Later, he learns Islam Bai has also survived, found by passing merchants near a white camel. In the memoir, that gives the story its survival shape. 3 survivors, 2 reported deaths, 6 or 7 camel losses, depending on how the final camel death is counted. But the count must keep its label. 3 survivors and 2 escort deaths in Hedin's account, contested in part by Baumann 2000. That is not a small footnote. It changes the type of story this is. The popular version asks, how did Hedin survive the desert? The better question is, how did Hedin's survival account become the place where everyone else's story had to live? What we know is enough for tragedy. The caravan entered the Taklamakan with 5 men and 8 camels. The water calculation failed. The camels were lost. Men were left behind. Hedin, Islam Bai, and Qasim survived in the account that made the crossing famous. What we do not know is just as important. We do not have Yolchi's voice. We do not have Muhammad Shah's voice. We do not have the opened 1895 field diary in front of us. We do not know how much of the blame structure was present in Hedin's field notes and how much was shaped by the published memoir 3 years later. That is why the answer is not Hedin lied, as if the case were closed. It should say something more precise. Hedin's authority is incomplete. His suffering was real. The water failure was real. The loss was real. But the version that became famous was written by the man who survived and later tested by a man who walked the route again and found the old memory did not hold cleanly. The verdict is this. The Taklamakan disaster was not only a failure of water, it was a failure of memory. Hedin's 1898 memoir became the dominant account of an event in which his own decisions mattered, while the local guide's knowledge survived mostly as blame. Baumann's 2000 retracing does not replace the memoir, but it does deny the memoir the right to stand alone. The desert nearly killed Hedin, but the record that survived did something quieter afterward. It made his version the place where everyone else had to live. At the end, The chronometer is still a beautiful object. It keeps time. It anchors observations. It belongs to the world Hedin wanted to build, measured, plotted, published, remembered. But the missing object is not the chronometer. It is the water map, not a paper map necessarily, a lived one, a map of wells that might be dug, loads that should not be carried, and distances that look possible only to someone who did not have to find water at the end of them. The chronometer survived as precision. The water knowledge survived as accusation.